Grand Theft Auto 5 speedrunning. You might ask, who the hell would want to speedrun a game that takes about 32 hours to complete casually? The answer is a surprising amount of people actually. It's quite popular. With GTA 5 now being 10 years old, it seemed like a perfect time to make this video showcasing how the world record times for all the categories have progressed over the years. These are all the categories that I'm going to be looking at individually, and at the end, I'll compare all the runs at the same time to see who is the most dominant runner in any given year. So any % classic, easily the most prestigious full run category that exists. The rules are simply that you can't fast travel with taxis, you can't use the in-game mission skip feature where you fail 3 times to skip ahead, you have to pick ending C, which is the canon ending anyway, and you can't use on mission 0 skip, something we'll talk about later in the categories where that's actually applicable. You can see here, D'Artes and Decap were the first 2 very dominant people on the scene, Decap dropping off pretty early. D'Artes existed longer, existing into my period where I was also fairly dominant, but you can see how long D'Artes held world record here without anyone really contesting him. I've popped into the scene here, and Torix as well being there. We too will come soon to trade blows with the world record, somewhat dethroning D'Artes as he moved on to other GTA games. Decap, of course, here falling out of favor, not competing at all. But you can see, especially compared to today, there's far fewer runners really contesting. For a while there, it was really just Torix, D'Artes, and me trading backwards and forwards. You can see the colors of these bars, by the way, are based on the year the run was made. So you can see 2018 pops into there and everything's green. But this is probably my most dominant time. I'm soon about to start uploading to YouTube, and it became a little bit hard to contest for world record while making YouTube videos. Burhack popping in here. This is a separate generation in a way to my own, I think. The dominance of Burhack, where he was just orders of magnitude better kind of than everyone else. Like I took world record back for a couple of days there, and then just Burhack immediately. Friendly Baron, probably the only person at the time giving him a run for his money. But Baron, of course, eventually left the scene as well. But look how dominant Burhack is here. Here's the new generation of runners in 2020. These runners largely being led by SZAU, also known as Saurus, who was the person to ultimately dethrone Burhack, and he was very dominant during this period. But of course, around this time, there were a lot of new runners starting in the scene, perhaps in large part inspired by a lot of my YouTube content, because this is when I was blowing up on YouTube, and certainly COVID was a big factor here. Everyone trapped indoors, like, hey, why don't we just speedrun GTA 5? That's a lot of time we can spend doing that. But you can see all these new runners, like there's no run here that wasn't made in 2021 or 2020. It just pushed everyone out. Burhack now being dethroned largely because he retired. What's happening right now, the reason why Saurus is so dominant and no other runs are appearing is because this category didn't exist for like a year and a half. You're gonna see soon the category is gonna come back, exist, and then just, oh look, here's all the new runs from 2022. I'll explain why this happened in the next category. Saurus having 750 days world record is probably not accurate. Arguably, Burhack was probably the most dominant person of all time, or maybe D'Artes, you could argue. Saurus, of course, being very dominant, but it's hard to say who would have held world record the longest if the category had actually existed for people to submit to. Unnamed, of course, very dominant right now in like every category, arguably the best runner. Of course, his introduction to speedrunning came from doing the no damage runs. Prior to that was not a speedrunner. After that, it's like, hey, if I can dominate no damage at GTA 5, I could probably dominate speedrunning as well. And he did. And so that's where things currently stand. Unnamed, Rhea, Saurus, Alex, and Matt in the top 5 positions. So many runs under 6 hours. Never would have expected that back when I was dominant in 2019, but so many optimizations have been made in the last couple of years. So again, the world record for any % classic is held by Unnamed with 5 hours, 42 minutes, and 31 seconds. So this next category, any % classic on mission 0 skip, is the same as the last category, but with one difference. You can use the on mission 0 skip. Grand Theft Auto 5 speedrunners now complete missions instantly with help from a surprising source.
Hey, bud!
We first start Cletus's side mission, but attempt to open director mode on the frames just before the mission begins. After being rejected and blowing ourselves up, the game gets confused. We are still on Cletus's mission, but all other missions are still available. Progressing with Cletus until the 5th checkpoint, we can transfer this checkpoint progress to another mission. We first must call Ursula or Liz to begin a one-night stand, which maintains the checkpoint progress and allows us to move far away from Cletus without failing. We then go to the location of another mission and blow ourselves up before it fully begins. The game then respawns us on the 5th checkpoint of the new mission, which either skips us far ahead or skips the mission entirely. The best part is that the game doesn't consider Cletus's mission to be complete, so we can repeat this trick. Doing this doesn't save time for every mission, but speedrunners can visit Cletus 10 times in some categories.
Hey, bud! What's up?
As you're going to see, it's not like it lets you skip the entire game or something, but it does fundamentally change how the run is done. You can see this category came into existence in 2021 when this strategy was discovered, and this coincides with in the other bar graph when nothing was happening. That's because this category and the other category were once combined together and have now been separated. So while this is now a separate category, you could see this bar graph as showing who was dominant in the other category between August 2021 and August 2022. So we start off with Raya out in the lead in this new era of on mission 0 skips, and spoilers, he is pretty dominant for a long time. He gets shortchanged in the previous graph because his world records have been moved into this one, but obviously during that 1 year period that is missing from the other graph, in this one, he is ridiculously strong. Only eventually, towards the end here, getting dethroned by Unnamed, and of course Alex taking world record for 6 hours. Not as many runs getting submitted here, in part because it's a harder category to complete runs in because so many more things can go wrong, but also it's not as fun. When a lot of the main categories had on mission 0 skip in them, that likely dissuaded a lot of people from running or had them play other categories that didn't have it in it. I suspect this is a big reason why it was separated into its own category, because it's a strategy that saves ultimately about 20 minutes and yet ruins the speedrun for a lot of people. And as you can see, Unnamed of course on top in this category as well, way dominant over Raya at this point by 5 whole minutes. Unnamed therefore having world record at 5 hours and 20 minutes and 35 seconds. So we now move on to any % taxis, which has the same rules as any % classic, except you can fast travel with taxis, which is actually very boring. All it enables you to do is skip the driving between missions, which doesn't save you that much time because you are no longer driving, receiving text messages. There's a variety of missions in the game that require particular text messages to spawn, and so if you don't get them while you're driving, and instead you just fast travel, it just means that you arrive at the mission and have to sit there for many minutes hoping to get the right text message so the mission spawns. And of course, using fast travel with a taxi isn't instantaneous. You've got to find a taxi, you've got to get into it, then put on your map where you want to go, and then wait for the loading before you eventually appear. And if you appear, you probably won't have the car you had before, so you've got to get a new car. All these things cost time. So the category only ever saved like 20 minutes, but required you to spend like half an hour waiting at various different points. It was awful. So people would do it just for the hell of it, but never really focusing on it all that much. You can see the same players big at the various different times in the classic % category, also being in this category, because it was just another thing to run whenever you wanted to do something different. There are some strategies involved with the taxis and how to manage text messages, but especially in the early days, there were very few strats to handle the text messages, so it was just a fairly dead category. These days, there are many optimizations, many strategies dealing with how to bring in text messages at various different times, because people have looked into the code, how different things work. It's still an annoyance. A lot of the routing of the entire game is based around getting these text messages at the right time, removing particular text messages from the pool at various different points. It's handled far better these days than it was back then. So I suspect there's going to be a lot more people submitting in these coming years with the new generations of runners. Of course, like as you can see, the same sort of people who are dominant in Classic were dominant here. And here's Unnamed coming in at the end just to be dominant in this category as well. Unnamed, while not having world record in every category, has world record in most categories, ending here at 5 hours and 25 minutes and 44 seconds. So we move on now to any % taxis on mission 0 skip, which has the same rules as any % taxi, except you can now use on mission 0 skip. What this basically does is that you do on mission 0 skip a lot, even more than the other on mission 0 skip category, because you have access to taxis. Wherever you are in the map, you can just taxi from there to Cletus to set up the on mission 0 skip and then transfer those checkpoints to another mission to skip that mission. So this category isn't very fun. There's very few people who've submitted, but as you can see, Unnamed dominant in this category as well. Same sorts of people and all that jazz. I'm largely including it for consistency's sake. No one likes this category. As you can see, no one's really running it. Regardless, the world record is held by Unnamed at 4 hours, 48 minutes and 21 seconds. So we now move on to any % mission skips, which the main difference is in this category, you can use the in-game mission skip feature. So you can use taxis, you can pick any ending. This doesn't have on mission 0 skip in it, but the mission skips is the main thing. In the game, if you fail 3 times, you can press spacebar then enter, then skip that section in which you failed 3 times in. Not every single section of the entire game is it faster to fail 3 times and then skip, but it's like 90% of the game. So it's, what is the fastest way that I can fail in this particular scene? Oh, I can shoot my gun, bang, 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 skip. And so it's really, really boring. Well, there is some strategy to it, finding the fastest way to fail, and the run has gotten optimized. You will see as it goes down here. but obviously not very fun and has the same problem with taxis. So you end up waiting at certain spots for text messages to come in for particular missions to spawn. As you can see with my having world record in this category for over 1,000 days, not many people run it. Or have ran it or will ever run it, because it's just a terrible, terrible run in that conceptually it's interesting finding the fastest way to fail, but running it is just fail, spam enter, because spamming enter gets you back into the game faster in missions. It actually makes it load in faster, which is an interesting thing. Again, another interesting thing that was found because of this category. And there have been optimizations that have been found in this category that have affected other categories as well, but it is technically the fastest way to get through the game. But you can understand why it's restricted as it is. Like, can you imagine if the main category of speedrun had mission skips? That would just be GTA 5 speedrunning dead from the get-go. It never would have developed as it has. And so that's where it ends. As you can see, Unnamed does not have world record in this category because even he is like, I don't want to do this, man, this sucks. So the world record is held by E4 is me at 3 hours, 10 minutes, and 24 seconds. So we now move on to 100% taxis, which has the same rules as any percent taxis, except now you also have to complete the 100% checklist in the game. It's not 100% of literally everything you can do in the game, but a checklist that Rockstar themselves have made. They don't even require you to do Michael or Trevor's side missions. Although you can understand their reasoning a bit, because if you kill Michael or Trevor, that would mean you couldn't get 100% completion, which would probably be bad for those people who pick those endings. You may find it weird that I'm starting with a taxi category rather than a non-taxi category, like I did with any percent, but if you look at the times that we're looking at here, no one really wanted to do a run that was even longer. So the taxi category, at least, narrowed that down, gave you more freedom of movement where you could go to get different collectibles and whatnot, saving you a bunch of time so that this already really, really long category wasn't so arduous. Taxis was the main prestigious category, the category that everyone wanted, although of course there were very few runners, because again, it's a 10-hour run. Even with all the optimizations over the 10-year period, it is still a ridiculously long category. Of course, we're seeing many of the familiar faces in this category. Basically, if you'd dominated in some respect in the other shorter categories, you were like, well, I want something else to do. I guess I'll do 100% as well, just to have all the world records, hopefully, which I did at various different points, and that's why I'm on this board. Look at how far the time has come down now, 9 hours and 30 minutes. That's a big difference from 11 hours back before. Bit more manageable, but even now, still a ridiculously long category. You can see why people favor more the any percent categories rather than 100%. Although 100% is quite fun because you do a lot more of the game. So 100% is a bit of a breath of fresh air if you can deal with the endurance factor, because this is like a stamina test as much as it is anything else. And there's Alex just at the end getting world record, unnamed, not in this category, surprisingly. But again, as you can see by how few runners were in this category, there's not much competition here. So the world record is held by Alex Honix at 9 hours, 31 minutes, and 13 seconds. So we now move on to 100% Classic, a category that's technically always existed, but no one bothered to run it until 2020. I guess, COVID and, of course, a new generation of runners who were like, let's do it, who cares? And you can see them bringing down their time quite fast. It turns out that if you route things very, very, very well, you don't save that much time with taxis. I think overall you save maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, which is funny because that's about how much you save in any percent as well. If you route things well enough, the ability to teleport around the map is not as relevant, of course, because as you're going from one place to another, you pick up all the things that you need. Similar sort of faces here, except without many of the old guard, of course, Saurus, Burhack, Rhea, and now, of course, Unnamed taking the world records here, and the time, as I say, ends up being 20 to 30 minutes different from the taxi category. So Unnamed has the world record at 9 hours, 56 minutes, and 58 seconds. So we now move on to Segments Trevor percent, which is not a full run, obviously it's why it's called Segments, it's just classic percent rules up until the end of the first heist. This category entirely exists because racing is a part of speedrunning, and racing a 6-hour category is not something very easy to do. Not everyone has 6 hours to throw away on doing a full run of the game, so people always want a shorter category that they can just sink their teeth into of a day if you have an hour free in some different races, and so Trevor percent was made. Trevor percent is the most submitted to category on the leaderboards, with over 800 people submitting, because, it's the easiest one to submit to. It only takes an hour compared to the full game, of course. Anyone who wants to get into GTA 5 speedrunning will usually end up doing like Trevor percent first, just to see how they like it, and moving from there. It's a category that, of course, it's very well optimized. It's very prestigious because everyone submits to it. It's a world record that you want to have, and all the main players that you see from all the other categories have held world record in this at some time or another. If you're dominating the other categories, you're probably going to be dominating this as well. Why is it called Trevor percent, you might ask? it's a bit of a meme, bit of a joke. It's had different names over the course of the life of GTA speedrunning, but Trevor is the one that stuck. Even when the leaderboard name changed, people would still call it Trevor because that's just what it's had for so long. They call it that because, well, it's basically we're doing everything up until the point where you unlock Trevor. We never play as Trevor. Prior to around 2020, 2021, can't remember the exact year, Trevor was the only segment on the leaderboards, but since then, segments have been made for every other part of the run as well that people grind to get their best times. I haven't bothered to make a bar graph for the other segment runs because they're just not as prestigious, not as popular. They haven't been around as long. Their history only spans a couple of years. But Trevor, it has a legacy. Look at this. It's gone down to 55 minutes. Me back in the day when I was running, struggling to get under an hour, barely achieving that. And the runs now are at 55 minutes. And so that's where this ends. And you can see how optimized things are. The top runners in this category are very close in terms of seconds, where in other categories, there's many minutes between all the different runners. Here, it's merely seconds. So Unnamed has the world record at 54 minutes and 35 seconds. So we now move on to the all stunt jumps category. Also not a full run of the game, it's just you need to complete all the stunt jumps in the game, of which there are 50. There are many people who've submitted to this category. It has been around for quite a long time, although it has been more popular in recent years. Like every speed game, GTA 5 has its handful of just minor side speedruns of various different things, objectives in the game that aren't true speedruns, but people still have them around because they're fun. I personally hadn't done any runs of it until 2023. It's just fun to compete in these small little trials, obviously. As you can see, a lot of interest being spurred on in part by Friendly Baron. He did have a guide that he produced for it. You can actually see that some people who have never held a world record in any other category held a world record at least at some point in this side category, as you can see in other side categories as well. Top runners often spending most of their time doing the big things, and if a small person comes in, doesn't want to compete with them, they can go these side categories and maybe eke out a world record in something that hasn't been run in quite a long time. So 1,426 days, Saurus has held the world record in this side category, and it still stands to this day. That's kind of nuts. So the world record is held by Saurus with 21 minutes and 51 seconds. So we end now with a comparison of just the world records over time, just in the full categories. I'm not going to bother with the segmented stuff. Of course, classic percent being the first category, eventually mission skips coming along after it, because it's the true any percent, or at least it was at the time. And that is a category that should always be in every speedrun. How can you get to the end of the game as fast as possible without any possible restrictions? Of course, the existence of mission skips often made it so people didn't have all the world records in the main categories because it was just such a dumb category that some people just did not want to run it, again, failing over and over again to skip ahead. But of course, I was perfectly willing to run it as a meme in a way, and of course, Torx took world record off me once or twice as well. But that enabled me to have, all the world records, as you can see there. Torx taking one back, me taking it back over and over again. But it wasn't until many years later, going into 2021 or 2020, 2021, where a lot more categories were made. We were just perfectly happy with these 4 categories here. Fewer runners. The competition seemed best to be condensed to a small amount of categories. Here's Burhack being dominant, of course, taking all the world records many times. People just trying to nip at his heels to take even one off him. That was, of course, eventually achieved by Saurus, who again gave Burhack a bit of a run for his money. Moving into 2020 now, another category has popped up, 100% Classic. Again, a category that always technically existed, but no one really bothered to run. It was hard enough to run all the other 4 categories as long as they were. But of course, that means it's even harder to have all the world records, given that there are technically 7 main categories. There are some other full run categories that aren't on this list, but they're just weird. No one cares about them. Very few people have submitted to them, or they're so new, they're so recent that they don't have a history, so it's not worth putting on this comparison. And so it ends there with Unnamed having 5 out of the 7 main category world records, E4 is me having 1 in mission skips, and Alex having 1 in 100% taxis. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Maybe I'll do it again at the 15-year anniversary, who knows. Hopefully GTA 6 will be out by then though. Of course, if you want to start speedrunning GTA 5, I highly recommend joining the dedicated GTA 5 speedrunning Discord. Many people always there will help you out with any questions you have. The community is still very active, and the more the merrier. And new developments are happening all the time. For example, very recently, replay warping was just found. This is where you attempt to start a mission replay, but then back out. And this makes it so the game remembers that location. So later on, when you save and load, it will warp you to that location, thinking you saved the game there. If you want one of these bar graph comparisons made for your speedrun, feel free to contact Biz Inc. on Discord. Thanks for watching, and I wish you all the best.